Welcome to another episode of Lewis Too Much Analyzes Comics. Nice to see ya. I'm going to be starting a new series, and in this series, what I wanted to do was dive into the personality types of superheroes. Now, for those who are familiar with the MBTI, from my perspective, is good at getting you these four letters right here. But there's actually a little bit more of an advanced way of understanding personality types, which in order to go really in depth, so if you do enjoy this video, if you want to get way more in depth, there's this channel called CS Joseph. And CS Joseph, I'm going to put a link in the description. That channel is amazing. I cannot recommend it more highly. And so I've spent the last year of my life listening to CS Joseph, reading books that he recommends, and getting really into these personality types and functions and all that kind of stuff. For me, if you want to understand MBTI, check him out. It's way more in depth than just the MBTI. That typically is just going to give you kind of like a general description of the personality with general features and characteristics and things like that. This is going to go way in depth as to how the mind actually processes information, makes decisions based on this function stack, which we're going to talk about a little bit, which we're going to talk about in depth actually during the course of this video. All right. And so, like I said, I want to go into the personality types of superheroes. I'm also going to do supervillains, but I wanted to start off with my favorite superhero, who is Batman. Batman's personality type is actually really consistent, because this is one of the tricks of delving into superhero personality types, is that because superheroes get touched by a number of different writers who may perceive them a little bit differently, their personalities will sometimes shift between writers, right? And so they're not written perfectly consistently. And so one of the things that I want to try and do as I do these personality type videos is kind of like take all of canon and compress it and then try and see which personality type emerges the most. And so that'll be a fun exercise for me. Now, Batman is actually somebody who I would say, for the most part, has been written actually really consistently as an INTJ. Now, what is an INTJ? All right, so before I can explain to you what an INTJ is, I have to explain to you what all these functions are. All right, and so there are four perceiving functions, and then there are four. Make sure I'm in camera. And then there are four decision-making functions. Okay, and so what the perceiving functions are doing is they are intaking information. So as you're walking through the world, you're experiencing the world through these four different functions. Each of us has all four of the functions in us. They're just operating in different ways, and depending on the intensity of that function inside of you, that's essentially what's going to determine your personality stack. Okay, and so the four perceiving functions are going to be introverted intuition, extroverted intuition, introverted sensing, and extroverted sensing. Now, in terms of introverted versus extroverted, this is really the best thing to keep in mind when you're trying to understand the functions, is that introverted is inwardly focused and it's typically trying to narrow things down, versus extroverted, which is externally focused and is typically trying to broaden things out. Okay? And so don't confuse it, although they are connected. Don't confuse it for what you'll typically see in culture, right? Which is that introverts like spending time alone and extroverts like spending time around people. Those things are true, but in terms of the functions, that's not necessarily all that the introverted versus extroverted is trying to accomplish. Okay. All right, and so let's kind of go right through Batman's function stack. Okay, as an INTJ, Batman leads with introverted intuition. Now, if you notice, kind of on the left-hand side for me of the board over here, you'll see that each of the functions is designated kind of like an archetype. And so the reason that it does that, C.S. Joseph, and he gets that from a doctor whose name is John Beebe, does it this way, is because depending on the intensity of the function as it lines up inside of you, it's going to give that function a certain sort of disposition, or an archetypal disposition, okay? And so the first of the functions is your hero function. It's your primary function. It's the main way that you engage with the world. It's the function that's going to come to your rescue whenever you're in a problem, and it's the function that you develop when you're really young pretty quickly. And essentially, it's the function that you come to rely on the most as you grow up. And so that's why it's called the hero function. So the hero function has a few features to it. Number one, it gives whatever function it lines up with a very positive orientation, a pleasurable orientation, so you enjoy experiencing that function. Like I said, it's a very well developed function, so you're going to be able to utilize it extremely well. And then finally, it's going to actually give it a bit of an arrogant function, or a bit of an arrogant tinge. And so the reason for that is that you want to think about it not so much as like a Superman type superhero, right, where he's very selfless. It's more like an old school superhero, right, like Conan the Barbarian, where, you know, he's sitting around in the pub, all the villagers come and they tell him, hey, there's a dragon outside. He smashes his beer cup on the table. He goes outside with his giant sword. The dragon is like passing by. He like hops on top of the dragon. He stabs the dragon a bunch of times in the head. The dragon is breathing fire all over the sky. The hero, he's just stabbing until finally the dragon crashes down, right? And then the hero comes back to the village and he says, bring me all the women, bring me all the gold. That's essentially the disposition of the hero function, right? It wants to be recognized for the fact that it's so good at doing what it does, right? And so it gives it this tinge of arrogance. And all of our hero functions have that. And so I know that we're going to talk about Batman and how he comes off a little bit arrogant. That has nothing to do with the fact that he has a hero function. Everybody has a hero function, and that hero function is going to have that tinge to it, okay? And so Batman leads, his hero function is introverted intuition, all right? And so the main way that Batman perceives the world, the main way that he takes information from the world into his mind is through this introverted intuition function. And so what does the introverted intuition function do? So what the introverted intuition function does is it picks up on patterns in the environment. And it's doing this unconsciously. It's not something that intuitors are doing intentionally. It's just happening to them. So their mind is just instantaneously, as they're walking through life, picking up on patterns in the environment. And so what introverted intuition tries to do with those patterns is actually boil them all down into one meta pattern. So what does that look like? So basically, like, let's take something like history. So history is a sequence, is essentially a gigantic stretch of patterns laid out before an intuitor, right? So intuitors are typically going to like history because of the fact that essentially what it's doing is it's picking up on large-scale patterns throughout the course of human interactions and all of that, right? And so what introverted intuition wants to do is actually boil down all of history into one meta-narrative, into one stretched-out narrative that all is interconnected. So that's really what introverted intuition wants to do, is it's taking all the patterns and trying to connect all the patterns into as few patterns as possible, and if possible, generate one pattern out of all the patterns. So that's what introverted intuition wants to do. Now, because introverted intuition does that, those who are really high in introverted intuition can be very willful people, because what their mind is doing is picking up on all these patterns, boiling them down into this one thing, and then generating for them a path forward in order to, for them to walk down, right? That's the whole point of introverted intuition. That's what it's trying to do, is from the meta pattern is create the one pathway that is the best pathway to move forward. And so introverted intuitives, I am an introverted intuitive, by the way, we're constantly trying to boil everything down into one thing and then pursue that one path no matter the cost, right? And so you can see you can see this in Batman all the time. So number one, right, his origin story, which we're gonna get to a little bit later as we get into one of the later functions, but his origin story, right, is that his parents are killed in an alleyway, and from there he makes a vow: I am going to fight crime, and he's gonna fight crime in this very specific way, right, which is to become a vigilante. And so his introverted intuition essentially maps out this giant meta pattern that plans out literally his entire life from the time that he's 8 years old. It spans outward, and he's basically like trying to dedicate his entire life to this one cause. And introverted intuitives can be very, very obsessive because of the fact that they get so tunnel visioned on this one pathway forward. And so that's Batman. Obviously, he's incredibly obsessive. Now, he's going to pair that with extroverted thinking. So extroverted thinking is going to be his second function. Now, if you notice over there, it says that the second function is your parent function. So what does that mean, that it's your parent function? So your second function has a parental sort of tinge to it. And so it has like a responsible tinge to it. So it almost gives whatever function falls there a sense of this is what should be done. It kind of like tells you internally, like, this is how you should approach, it depends on the function, but basically, like, it's going to give it that responsible tinge. And so let me get into how that affects Batman, right? So he has extroverted thinking as his parent function. So extroverted thinking is all about it's all about systems, really. That's what it's trying to do. So extroverted thinking wants to impose order on the world. It does not like anything to fall out of the outside of structure. And so extroverted thinking, again, it's really, that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to impose order in the world. Extroverted thinkers are very quick thinkers. They're very efficient thinkers. So extroverted thinking, and I'm going to compare that a little bit later to introverted thinking. But extroverted thinking is trying to get to the point as quickly as possible. It doesn't want to waste time like plodding through research and things like that. And so what extroverted thinkers do is they actually absorb information from the people that are around them and collect them all into this like giant system. Now, because Batman has introverted intuition as his lead function and then extroverted intuition as his second function, this generates a very obsessive personality, and it's somebody that's going to be obsessed with detecting patterns in large-scale systems to then try and generate the best possible meta system of order. And that's why, like, if you've ever read the book Kingdom Come, the way that Batman ends up when he's older in that story is by basically like structuring all of Gotham into, it's not exactly a police state, but it might as well be, right? He has all these bat robots like patrolling all over the city. If you've ever read the Tower of Babel, that's actually another really good example of extroverted thinking. So extroverted thinking, the other thing that it does is it's constantly coming up with contingency plans. It's really the introverted intuition with extroverted thinking, that combo together. It's always coming up with contingency plans because it's always trying to fit everything back into the pattern. And so it's like, okay, well, so if this thing goes wrong, how do I scoot it back into the pattern? How do I maintain my system of order? And so in the Tower of Babel story, what Batman does is it's revealed because Ra's al Ghul ends up like tapping into I haven't read that story in a long time, so I might get some of the details wrong here, but Ra's al Ghul ends up hacking Batman's computer, if I'm remembering right, and he steals from the Bat computer every one of the Justice League's weaknesses, because Batman had actually planned out a contingency where where in the event that any one of his best friends essentially in the Justice League ever go bad, then he has the contingency plan already to essentially defeat them. And so Ra's al Ghul taps into that, and he ends up essentially paralyzing the Justice League because of the fact that Batman has all these contingency plans. And what's awesome is that Batman even has a contingency plan to defeat himself. So this is what Introverted Intuition and Extroverted Thinking do together. And so the reason that I say that the parent function gives it a sense of responsibility is that Batman's extroverted thinking is like a dutiful extroverted thinking, that it's like, this is what you need to do. You need to have contingency plans. If not, you're an irresponsible person. Why would you not have contingency plans? You have to have contingency plans in order to be a good person. That's essentially what the parental tinge is going to do to extroverted thinking. All right, the next of Batman's functions is introverted feeling. Now this is, when I started understanding personality types and I first connected it to Batman, I was like, oh my goodness, man, like this, number one, it enriches his character, but also it like devastated me. I was like, oh, poor Batman. All right, so here's how the introverted feeling works for Batman. So introverted feeling, number one, is essentially your mind's connections to your own personal emotions. And so so introverted feelers, higher introverted feelers than Batman, when introverted feelers make decisions, they make decisions based on essentially their emotional reaction to situations. Now, a bunch of things get tied into your introverted feeling. So your introverted feeling, because of the fact that it's tied into your emotions, and it's tied into your emotional experience, typically what will happen to introverted feelers is, number one, so for higher introverted feelers, we'll talk about how this impacts Batman in a second, but for higher introverted feelers, when they get affected by, or when something happens to them that causes an emotional reaction, they experience those emotions very intensely. And so if they're in love, that love will almost like consume them. If they are angry at somebody, that anger can almost consume them. If they're betrayed, that betrayal, they'll become obsessed with that betrayal, right? And so, again, introverted feeling, and so actually, so the thing that will generate out of that is a sense of morality. So your morals tend to be tightly connected to your introverted feeling, because introverted feeling essentially has had experiences, right? Emotional experiences. High introverted feelers are actually really good on picking up on the emotions of others because they're so connected with their own feelings. And so introverted feeling, what it'll do is it'll generate a sense of morality based on the fact that they've had these emotional experiences. So if an introverted feeler that has been really passionately in love is going to want everybody to experience that same sort of passionate love. And so they'll, essentially generate morality systems that are all about, like, everybody should get to experience this, or high introverted feelers tend to be artists, right? And so they'll champion causes that have to do with art because of the fact that art makes them feel so good that then they'll want art, to be essentially like spread through the community. Now, if they are betrayed, if something bad happens to them, they are very big on revenge because of the fact that introverted feeling, when it experiences that deep feeling. If you've ever seen the movie The Crow is definitely a high introverted feeler in that movie. As is the author. I'm very confident about that. And so that's what. So introverted feeling. People that have high introverted feeling tend to be very justice oriented. So it's like, if this bad thing happens, then this punishment needs to be executed as a result of that. Okay. So how does that apply to Batman? So for everybody that has read Batman, you know that he's not a very emotional character. The reason for that is because he leads with these top two functions. So these top two functions are going to be his strongest functions. For the most part, human beings, they live in their top two functions. Now, the other functions are going to still come into play. And so how does that come into play for Batman? All right, so your third function has a very childish disposition, an almost naive disposition. And so for INTJs and Batman, a lot of times what that looks like is they don't really know what their emotions are, or what emotion they're feeling, or they have a hard time like pinpointing their emotions, right? And so they have a very naive approach to emotions, in the sense that like they might even like think like, oh, those are not important, emotions are not important, when in reality, you know, their emotions are like all stirred up inside of them, right? And so Batman, when he's a child, a literal child, his parents are murdered in front of him, which strikes right at his introverted feeling child, right? And so that is why he dedicates his entire life to the pursuit of justice and to embodying revenge, right? He's embodying vengeance, which, if you notice, Batman, you know, like it's kind of like a common psychological analysis of Batman, that he's like a stunted child, right? That's why he has Batmobiles and Bat computers and Bat planes and Batarangs and all of that, right? Like he's still an 8-year-old child, like in a sense, playing pretend, but he's utilized that state to essentially change the world and impact the world in a positive way. I'm not one of those people that thinks that Batman is wasting his billions being Batman. I think that it's exceptionally noble for him to dedicate his entire life to rescuing other people, and I think that ultimately people don't understand symbolism and don't understand something that is covered in Batman Begins extensively, which is that Batman is trying to transcend, that you don't fix all problems just by throwing money at them. You fix problems by becoming a symbol, by becoming something better than humanity itself, or by being an ideal that humanity can aspire to, right? And so that's what Batman does. And so with his childish, introverted feeling, he dedicates his entire life to embodying that spirit of justice and vengeance, right? All right, so then finally, that's going to lead us to extroverted sensing, his extroverted sensing inferior function. So extroverted sensing is another perceiving function. What it does is it essentially connects your mind to your 5 senses and to present reality. And so extroverted sensing, you just have to, it's honestly the easiest function to explain. It's essentially the experience of your tactile senses. So when you're smelling something, when you're tasting something, whenever you're experiencing something with your physical senses, your mind is connected to extroverted sensing in that moment. Now, higher extroverted sensors are all about like the sensory experience that they're giving to other people, and it's also all about like trying to engage in as many sensory experiences as possible. So what does this look like for Batman? Because as you notice, it's all the way towards the bottom of his functions, right? So for Batman, he has extroverted sensing inferior. Now, there's a couple of things to talk about here with respects to Batman, but I'm going to talk about how this would typically impact an INTJ, and then why it actually appears as if Batman doesn't suffer from this, okay? So for an INTJ, typically, extroverted sensing, because it's their inferior function, it gives, so this is what the inferior function does. The inferior function wants to be like the hero function, except that it's not good enough to do that. And so essentially what it'll typically do is get you into trouble, because it'll fail you. Now, what you need to do in order to develop the inferior function, and you can develop your inferior function, but you have to pour a ton of discipline into that inferior function. So whatever function in your personality is your inferior function, if you pour a lot of discipline into that function, you can actually develop it into a very capable function, which is exactly actually what Batman does. So extroverted sensing, like I said, is all about the tactile environment, the experience of the senses. So your coordination is very much tied into extroverted sensing. Really high extroverted sensors tend to be like athletes, So if I can tell you a few comic characters like Deathstroke, Deadshot, people like that. Those are really high extroverted sensors. They're probably IST. I think Deathstroke is an ISTP or ESTP. Each of them is one or the other. I'm not remembering now off the top of my head. But they have very high extroverted sensing, which is their connection to the physical environment. They have a lot of hand-eye coordination, right? So what does Batman dedicate his entire life to doing since the time that he's 8 years old is developing his extroverted sensing by studying martial arts, by studying all kinds of martial arts, by essentially learning to manipulate every little element of his body. So he develops his extroverted sensing into essentially a weapon, and more, I mean, I don't know which is his better weapon, right? Because his mind, which was almost naturally developed by him having extroverted thinking, is probably right on par with his with his body, which is essentially what extroverted sensing is tied into. It's that, again, that physical, that grasp of the physical world. Now, if you notice, Batman, a lot of times what he'll do, right, is he'll retreat into the Batcave to essentially spend time just calculating and puzzling things in his mind, and that's because his preference is actually to live at the top, which is in introverted intuition, extroverted thinking land, and processing through things. That's why he's the world's greatest detective, right? But he also has mastery over his fourth inferior function. All right. Now that's going to cover Batman's ego. In psychology terms, the ego is essentially the conscious part of you, the part of you that's making decisions. As I'm talking, that is my ego that is sending me the words to speak. Now, your mind also has a feature, which is that it essentially houses a number of unconscious processes. Some of the more like just obvious unconscious processes are things like your heart beating or your breathing, right? Like your body does that unconsciously. Sure, you can summon control at least of your breathing, right? And I guess like there are certain people, you know, that are very skilled that can summon control of things like their heartbeat and body temperature, all of that kind of stuff, right? But for the most part, most of us do these things unconsciously, right? So these are unconscious functions of the body. Your mind, your thinking mind, also has unconscious processes. That's, you know, if you're a Freudian, that's essentially where dreams come from, right? And so the unconscious part of your mind houses essentially the opposite of your ego functions. And so those actually come into play to me, the unconscious functions are actually even more fun because they almost manipulate us without us recognizing that they're manipulating us. And so let's get into how that works for Batman, okay? All right, so the first of your unconscious functions is your villain function. Now, why is it called the villain function? It's called the villain function because it antagonizes the hero function. So the villain function is the opposite of the hero function, and what it does, so let's stay specific to Batman, right? When I do other superheroes, we can do some of the other different functions and how that would look. But for Batman, he has extroverted intuition as his villain function. Now, extroverted intuition is the opposite of introverted intuition. So introverted intuition is trying to boil everything down into one meta story. Extroverted intuition, what it does is it still picks up on patterns, so it's very good at pattern detection, but what it wants to do is actually blow up the pattern into a variety of different puzzle pieces and then ask each of the puzzle pieces, well, what if I move this puzzle piece here and then I connect it with all of these puzzle pieces from a different puzzle, and then does that generate a new puzzle? And so extroverted intuition is all about what ifs. It's trying to predict all the possible futures. So if you've ever seen Avengers Endgame, no, I'm sorry, Infinity War, when Doctor Strange is sitting there meditating and he's like perceiving all the 100 million different realities that are possible, that's extroverted intuition. Doctor Strange in that movie is an ENTP. He's puzzling through all of the different extroverted intuitive pathways, right? So where introverted intuition is all about boiling things down to one pathway, extroverted intuition is all about breaking it up and trying to analyze all the different pathways that are possible. Okay, so what does that look like for Batman? How does his extroverted intuition antagonize his introverted intuition? So one of the things about your hero function is that because it can be arrogant, it needs to be humbled in order for you to become a complete person. And so what the villain tries to do is essentially, again, antagonize the hero and poke at the hero. And so what Batman's extroverted intuition is going to do is tell him it's going to tell him, your one way of doing things, your one pathway that you're pursuing is not the only pathway. There are multiple pathways that different people might be on that are not the same as yours. And so you'll see that this is a constant conflict for Batman, right? That he has like this one way of doing things, but then, you know, Superman is a completely different sort of person, and he's a superhero just like Batman, right? And he's a much more hopeful and aspirational sort of a hero. Well, Batman's extroverted intuition is going to essentially confront him with the reality that Superman exists as a person and is just as effective as he is, even though Superman operates in a completely different way. Dick Grayson is another example of this, right? Like, Dick Grayson is a very outgoing personality. He's a little bit more of a showboat than Batman. He's still a detective. He's still trained to be a detective, and he still has leadership qualities and all of that kind of stuff. And so Batman, again, is confronted with the reality that there's different ways of approaching life than his one way. Now, you'll notice that Batman, one of his big struggles, right, is that he always wants to he always wants to go back to his one way, and not be surrounded. So if you've ever read the story Batman Murderer, there's this point where essentially what happens is, for those who haven't read it, is that Bruce Wayne gets framed for a murder, and so he gets arrested, and then, you know, he's Bruce Wayne, so obviously he escapes. And so the rest of the Bat family is all trying to figure out what happened. Some of them are questioning whether or not Bruce actually did it, but for the most part, you know, there are certain members of the Bat family that are convinced, you know, Bruce would never do that. And so when Bruce comes back and he suits up as Batman, everybody's like, all right, what are we going to do, boss? And he basically makes the declaration that he's going to give up on his Bruce Wayne identity, dedicate himself to just being Batman, and he really wants the Bat family to disband so that he can be Batman all by himself. And it takes the Bat family all, you know, essentially arguing with him to eventually, and a series of other dramatic events, right, to excite the reader, essentially confront Batman with the reality that his one way of doing things is completely absurd in this situation, right? Like, you can't just push away all of your friends and family that love you so that you can focus on your one insane, myopic way of doing things, right? And so his extroverted intuition villain is essentially absorbing all those experiences and confronting his hero and telling him, hey, look, this isn't the only way that you can do this, okay? Now, typically, your worry, like the source of your worries, is your villain function. Now, the reason for that, right, is because your hero is so equipped to solve problems for you that your villain, when it confronts the hero, essentially makes the hero cower and be like, oh no, am I doing this wrong, right? I mean, it won't necessarily cower, but like that's one of the potential possibilities, is that it cowers, right? And so the villain houses a lot of your worry because it's so. And so for Batman, what he'll worry about, right, is that he didn't do his detective work the exact correct way, right? So that'll be like in The Long Halloween. Batman spends like days and days and days trying to figure out who the holiday killer is, and it the introverted intuition is making it an obsession for him, but his extroverted intuition villain is trying to generate all the different possibilities for him and tell him, what if it's this? What if it's this? What if it's this? You're so sure that it's this one person, but what if it's this person? What if it's this person? And so that's how the extroverted intuition villain is going to work. All right, that's going to bring us to Batman's next function, which is introverted thinking, and that is his critic function. So the reason that it's a critic function is very simple. It has a very critical disposition. If it's an introverted function, typically the way that it's going to work is it's actually going to criticize whoever is housing that function. So in the case of Batman, what's going to happen is introverted intuition is all about logic. So it's all about like step-by-step processes. It's all about like research so that you can come it. So the way that introverted thinking works is it starts with a premise and it works from that premise out to its conclusion. And so that's in contrast to extroverted thinking, which just collects data so that it can try and formulate a system, right? And so extroverted thinking a lot of times can cut corners because it really is all about efficiency. It just wants to get to that efficient end goal, versus introverted thinking, which is very like regimented and procedural. And so what will happen to Batman is that his introverted thinking critic is going to tell him that he hasn't done enough research, that he isn't smart enough, that he needs to process things more logically, and it'll actually like it. Typically, this is a lot of the times the source of your neuroticism. But also, what it's going to do is the critic holds you to this like impossible standard. And so in Batman's case, what it's doing is it's holding him to this impossible standard in terms of his intellect. You are not smart enough, Batman. You need to study more. You need to do more research. So that's essentially how it's going to work. And it's going to plague inside that feeling of like, I'm not smart enough. I need to continue to get smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter. And then the critic is typically, because you're holding yourself to such a high standard, then you will in turn typically hold others to that same high standard, which will usually be a big source of your personal hypocrisy, because of the fact that that critic is attacking you all the time, that then you'll then attack others for not living up to the standard that your critic is holding you up to. And so in Batman's case, right, he's always doing that to all of his sidekicks. They're not prepared enough. They're not, smart enough. They're, all the kind of things that he does with the Robins, right? The next is going to be his Trickster function. Now, the Trickster function for me is probably my favorite function, just because it's so messed up. So basically, what it does to Batman is extroverted feeling is essentially your connection to other people's feelings. Now, like I said before, with introverted feeling is all about your connection with your own personal emotions. And so introverted feelers tend to actually have a certain degree of sympathy. Tend to have sympathy because of the fact that they're so aware of their own emotions. Extroverted feeling is all about making decisions based on the emotions of others. And so it's all about taking into consideration the emotions of others. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that extroverted feelers always know what other people are feeling, but it does, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about a more extroverted feeling hero. But in the case of Batman, essentially what the Trickster extroverted feeling function does is the Trickster essentially takes that function and it confuses it, and it like blurs that function. So it's basically like almost like a non-functioning function, but it's still there. It's just like it's all static. And so what Batman's extroverted feeling function does is it makes him not aware at all of how other people around him are feeling and how he's making the people that are around him feel. And so because of that, he ends up coming off as very gruff and very uncaring sometimes, even though Batman is an exceptionally caring person, right? Like, he is constantly like giving money to charity, like a bunch of his money to charities. He's dedicated literally his entire life to protecting people. And yet the people that are closest to him, he is always like treating them in a way that makes them seem very, makes them feel like he doesn't care about them, when in reality he does care about them. The problem is that extroverted feeling Trickster doesn't, it essentially prevents him from understanding how he's making other people feel and how the people around him are feeling. And so other people's feelings are going to be very confusing to him, which you can see that happen to Batman pretty much all the time. All right, and then that's going to bring us to the last of the functions, which is introverted sensing. So introverted sensing. So I am an INFJ. I actually share this. I actually share these functions with Batman. These functions are flipped around for me. So I share this last introverted sensing function with Batman. Uh, Introverted sensing to me is the most difficult function to explain because it's the function that I experience the least because it's all the way down at the bottom of my function stack. So what does introverted sensing do? So introverted sensing is also a tactile function. It's also a perceiving function. So it's taking in sensory data. What it does, though, in contrast to extroverted sensing, is it's trying to narrow down all of the sensory data into its best possible version for that person. And so let me give you an example because that's going to help you to understand it a little bit better. So an introverted sensor, a high introverted sensor, is going to go through a number of experiences. And once they've built up a certain number of experiences, they will have kind of like a rank order of experiences in their life. And they have very easy access to those sensory experiences. They can recall them very quickly to mind, right? And so because of that, they will basically like pick some of their preferred sensory experiences and want to live in those preferred sensory experiences and not want to change and experience new sensations. Now, the problem with that, right, is that then they can stay stuck in like a comfort zone and not move out of that comfort zone. A lot of that function also generates a number of things. So it's going to generate a sense of loyalty, right? Because introverted sensors do not like change very much because, again, they're trying to stay in that best sensory experience. And so they won't like change very much. Now, because they don't like change very much, again, it'll make them very loyal. Because once they're in a committed relationship, they will stay in that committed relationship because they don't want to have to go out and generate new sensory experiences. They like the sensory experience that they're in right now. And so one of the other things that introverted sensing does is it's very like fact-based. It's very like structured. And so what that looks like is they're going to stick to it's basically like sticking to like daily routines because it's why I say that it's very difficult for me to explain this one function, but it'll generate like a sense of like routine and like it'll be concerned with routines in the physical environment, like not so much like mental routines, but like routines in the physical environment. Okay, so what does all that to say? What does that do to Batman? So because Batman has this all the way at the bottom of his function stack, Batman will not take care of himself because introverted sensing, that's one of the things that it does, is it tells you to stay in a routine, right? So that you can essentially retain the best possible sensory experiences. So Batman will not care about that whatsoever. He will not want to stay necessarily in a comfort zone, and so he will spend, right, like, so if you've ever read Long Halloween, in Long Halloween he literally spends like 3 days without sleeping while he's trying to investigate this crime, right? So essentially this pairs with this because his introverted intuition is making him obsessed. His introverted sensing all the way at the bottom, since it barely works, it basically just tells him like, oh yeah, it doesn't matter if you take care of yourself, just abuse your body as much as you want. And I mean, that's really like Batman's whole mission, is him abusing his body. It also makes him very disloyal. That's another problem that Batman has, right? In Batman, in Bruce Wayne Murderer, he does that to his family. It's like, oh, just everybody get away from me, and like, I'll just take care of this all by myself. The same thing when he's interacting with the Justice League. If you've ever watched Justice League, the animated series, Batman makes himself a part-time member because he doesn't want to be committed to a group. Batman is disloyal. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have high morals, which will sometimes tell him you need to be loyal, but just by nature, he's not loyal. So high introverted sensors are very loyal by nature. And so INTJs in general are very good actually about if you have harmed them, they'll close the door on you, and that'll be that. And you notice that actually in Batman Beyond, the animated series, that, you know, basically at the end of Bruce's life, he's shut everybody out of his life because whatever, they didn't live up to that super high standard that he sets for them, and now at the end of his life, he's all alone, and he really doesn't care that much that he's all alone, or at least he doesn't think that he cares that much that he's all alone. Secretly, of course, his introverted feeling child does want to be around other people, but that's why Terry McGinnis comes into the picture. All right, and so that is Batman as the INTJ. I hope that this video was enjoyable for all of you. I'm going to be doing a bunch more because I really enjoy talking about this stuff. I will see you next time.